Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back from lunch. Our next session is floodplain regulations, violations and enforcement, presented by Stephanie Frechette, a principal planner here at the Office of Planning and Development, and by Sarah Thunberg, who a former employee here at the Office of Planning and Development, who's now the Flood Ready Maine Program Manager at the Maine Office of Community Affairs. We are still, looks like, trying to find Sarah. Let's see. Stephanie is definitely here. I hear that, do not see Sarah's name. Oh, here she is. Okay, I can whoop. Just a sec, I'm gonna promote Sarah, make her a presenter. Okay, great. So now we can continue. Just a little background on our speakers. Before she was at Office of Planning and Development, Sarah Thunberg worked as a meteorologist for the National Weather Service in Gray, Maine, where she helped communities and emergency managers prepare for hazardous weather events, including several federally declared flooding disasters. She received her Bachelor of Science in Atmospheric Sciences from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign in 2019, and her MS in Atmospheric Sciences from the University of Alaska, Fairbanks in 2021. Stephanie Frechette joined OPD last year, January 2025, and has been working on implementing FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program to municipalities. She's been with the state for over 10 years, working in emergency planning and security, water quality analysis, and public water system regulation, as well as helping municipalities with state and federal compliance. Stephanie graduated from the University of Vermont with a BS in environmental science and a concentration in water resources. So with all that, I'm going to advance the slide. Ready to start, and looks like Stephanie's starting, so she just took control.
Thanks, Ken. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, and you can see the screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. This presentation will focus on violations and enforcement of floodplain ordinances. And even though that is the focus, the process of issuing violations and enforcement is generally the same as how you handle other violations in your zoning regulations. Many of our New Hampshire communities are participating in FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program, so we're going to be speaking in the context of that program. And that is a federal program that was created by Congress and administered by FEMA. It establishes regulations for safe flood-informed development in floodplains and provides flood insurance for any resident in a participating community. In New Hampshire, 94% of our communities are actively participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP. So this means that this presentation will be applicable to the majority of the attendees that are here today. Participating communities of NFIP are required to enforce local floodplain regulations and correct any violations, whether they come from a local complaint or through notice from FEMA. This session will discuss FEMA's expectations for participating communities, go through some common violations that are seen in New Hampshire, and what actions communities can take to exhaust all enforcement mechanisms. As Ken mentioned, also presenting with me today is my former colleague, Sarah Thunberg. Even though she's moved on to a new position, she is here to share her knowledge and experience with the program. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to go through the National Flood Insurance Program overview and FEMA expectations, go through some common violations and minimum requirements, how to issue and correct violations, go through some best practices and tools for compliance before we have a Q&A. And to start, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. Again, I am Sarah Thunberg. I, up until about a month ago, was one of the National Flood Insurance Program coordinators for the state of New Hampshire. And I'm now working at the Maine Office of Community Affairs. But my experience with the National Flood Insurance Program is transferable for either state. So to start with, the National Flood Insurance Program, as Stephanie had alluded to, was created by Congress in 1968. And it's a federal program that's administered by FEMA. It is a voluntary partnership between FEMA and the participating communities, in which communities agree to adopt and enforce the minimum NFIP regulations in their floodplain ordinances, and in turn, FEMA offers flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program to any residents of that community. So there are three main components of the National Flood Insurance Program. The first of which is knowing your risk through floodplain mapping. The second component is reducing your risk through floodplain regulations. And finally, insuring your risk through flood insurance. So today we'll be focusing on mostly kind of the floodplain regulations side of things. But there are other NFIP trainings available on our YouTube page, which you are free to check out after this. So, like I said, the National Flood Insurance Program is a voluntary partnership. It is not required, but the communities that do decide to participate agree to adopt and enforce local floodplain regulations through a local permitting process. And in turn, FEMA offers flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program to all residents in that community. We have 94% participation in New Hampshire, which is really, really great to see. And on this map, everything shown in white is considered a participating community. Red is not participating, and any yellow communities are suspended. So there are different roles and responsibilities depending on the level of government you're working at. So I'm going to start with going over the federal responsibilities, aka FEMA's roles and responsibilities. So FEMA is the entity that makes the flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program available for all participating communities. And this includes property owners, residents, and renters in the community. FEMA is also responsible for identifying the flood risks through mapping the floodplain and providing guidance on safe development and construction in floodplains. And then that translates to establishing development standards and providing guidance on safe flood-informed development within the floodplain. And then finally, FEMA is monitoring compliance for participating communities to ensure that all of the communities in the National Flood Insurance Program are administering the same minimum regulations. Now, at the state level, the Office of Planning and Development is where the National Flood Insurance Program is run for the state of New Hampshire. And Stephanie is the NFIP state coordinator. And here at the state level, we provide technical assistance to all stakeholders. This can include anyone, or this can include just answering questions from community officials, surveyors, engineers, developers, or residences on issues related to mapping updates or understanding development requirements within the floodplain, or updating the community ordinance. So all kinds of technical assistance we're able to offer at the state level. We also provide education and outreach resources such as model floodplain regulations, fact sheets, and sample permits. And then there's also the post-disaster scenarios where the state NFIP coordinator can also provide assistance after disaster when rebuilding to make sure that the minimum NFIP requirements are still being met. And then when mapping updates happen, the state NFIP coordinator is working with communities to provide oversight of the process and make sure that we are communicating with every municipality to make sure that they are aware of the mapping updates, and if there's any ordinance updates to the language that is needed, that is incorporated before the new maps get published. We also will conduct ordinance reviews. This can be at time of new maps or just a request for an ordinance review. And we can provide guidance on the state model ordinance language, as well as to assist communities to ensure that they stay compliant with the National Flood Insurance Program. And there's also a higher standards model ordinance that we can assist communities with if they want to adopt more than the minimum NFIP regulations. So at the community level, the community is the one doing the day-to-day work of floodplain management. So communities are expected to understand their own regulations, what FEMA maps are, or what the FEMA maps show as the flood zone in the community, what those zones are. And the community officials are responsible for ensuring that all local permits are applied for all development within the special flood hazard area. This includes reviewing and processing permit applications and ensuring that the floodplain development, including the community's own floodplain development, is built according to the approved permits and the floodplain regulations. If for any reason that the floodplain regulations or the permit is not followed, it is the community's responsibility to take enforcement actions and to correct those violations. Sometimes a community is not adequately enforcing their floodplain regulations, and if this occurs for a prolonged period of time, or it keeps coming up, then FEMA may consider suspending the community. And suspension means that, or in general, if a community gets suspended, property owners will not be able to purchase NFIP flood insurance policies, and all existing policies will not be able to be renewed. Federal grants or loans for development will not be available in identified flood hazard areas under programs administered by federal agencies such as the Department of Housing and Urban Development or the EPA and the Small Business Administration. All of those loans would not be eligible for suspended communities. Federal disaster assistance for flood damage would also not be provided to repair insurable buildings that are located in identified flood hazard areas. Additionally, if there aren't a lot of policyholders in the community, suspension can impact future property sales, such as if a home is in the floodplain and the buyer cannot get insurance, they might choose to not close on the house. Additionally, if a community becomes suspended and reapplies to join the National Flood Insurance Program, they have to address any floodplain development that happens in the meantime and prove that that development is still meeting the minimum NFIP regulations. So there are consequences to being suspended, and both the state and FEMA would like to see communities being proactive to avoid becoming suspended, and doing whatever they can to maintain compliance with the National Flood Insurance Program. So that's why we're talking about violations and enforcement today, because a lot of staying compliant means enforcement actions. So I'm going to discuss some of the most common violations that are seen for the National Flood Insurance Program. They can generally be grouped into two categories, one being unpermitted development in the floodplain, and the other being when development within the floodplain does not comply with the permit issued by the community. So yeah, unpermitted development is the most common, or one of the most common violations in the special flood hazard area. So FEMA has a much broader definition of what is considered development than a lot of state level development is defined. So FEMA defines development as any man-made change to improved or unimproved real estate, including but not limited to building or other structures, mining, dredging, filling, grading, paving, excavating, or drilling operations, or storage of equipment or materials. So the big thing to remember is any man-made change to the land. And FEMA requires that all proposed development in any special flood hazard area shall require a permit. And this is where a lot of development, or a lot of communities can see issues, is if there's, well, driveway permits tend to be fairly standard, but if someone's just like repaving or dredging or putting in some fill, since it wouldn't necessarily be building development, it might not be included in a regular permit application. But this is why we encourage communities to have their own floodplain development permit, because it incorporates a much broader scope of work. So some of the examples of unpermitted development is one of the common ones is that structures are either being constructed or were constructed without a permit. This means that they may not meet the building requirements included in the floodplain regulations. Another example is improvements to structures without a substantial improvement or substantial damage determination. So every existing structure in the floodplain must have a determination made for any improvements. There are a few exceptions to that rule, but generally, a substantial improvement determination is always needed. Substantial improvement just means that if you improve a structure within the floodplain by 50% of its market value or more, then regardless if that structure was built before the flood insurance program existed, that structure would then need to be brought into today's floodplain management standards. Again, there's on the other side of it is substantial damage. So if there's a structure that was damaged by more than 50%, it would also have to be brought into the modern day floodplain regulations. And a lot of communities after a disaster happens will have many structures that have been damaged and can sometimes miss the requirement to do a substantial damage determination for all those structures. And it does take up a lot of time. So that's just something that you want to be very careful about in the rebuilding process after a disaster, is to make sure that you are doing those assessments. All right, so placement of fill. This is a very common example of non-building development that's in the floodplain. Though it may not be a structure, it still does need to be permitted according to FEMA. And it must meet any watercourse requirements in the floodplain regulations. Same goes for excavating of earth or materials and storage of equipment or materials. This non-building development still requires a permit and must meet the watercourse requirements of the floodplain regulations. So the second category of common violations is that the development in the floodplain does not follow the permit that was issued by the community. We see this a lot. So we're going to spend some time talking about this type of violation in the following slides, but some examples can include the lowest floor or the lowest horizontal member of the structure being below base flood elevation or freeboard. Another is when the structure has a basement or accidentally becomes a basement, and it could be missing the required flood openings. Another one that I had talked about is the in the previous slide is substantial improvement and substantial damage requirements not being met. And another one that can get communities is recreational vehicle requirements not being met. So we're going to go over each of these in the next slides, starting with the lowest floor or the lowest horizontal member of a structure. So in A zones, which are all of the inland zones, the lowest floor is required to be at least at or above, or the top of the lowest floor must be at or above the base flood elevation. And so adopted in the community regulations for A zones, the top of the lowest floor should be at or above the base flood elevation or the designed flood elevation if your community has adopted higher standards. Now, for V zones, which are coastal zones, there are a little bit higher standards for these, just because the wave action that comes from the ocean puts more strain on the structure. And the requirement for V zones is that the bottom of the lowest horizontal structure member must be at or above the base flood elevation, or the designed flood elevation. And this is not an approximation. To determine these elevations, you must submit as-built elevation data provided post-construction by the property owner to ensure that there are that all of the bottom of the lowest horizontal structure member is at or above the base flood elevation or higher if a community has a higher freeboard requirement. Something to also note is for the communities that have adopted or enforced the state building code, even though it's not an NFIP requirement, please be aware that the state of New Hampshire requires at least 1 foot of freeboard above the base flood elevation, or the designed flood elevation for residential structures. And in case you're not sure what freeboard is, it is the distance from that base flood elevation to the lowest structure, or the lowest component of the structure. All right, so something that gets a lot of homeowners is having a basement in the floodplain. So basements, as defined by the National Flood Insurance Program, are any structure with an enclosed area below grade on all 4 sides. Now, on any new construction or substantial improvement, this is not permitted in the special flood hazard area. This is to avoid the bathtub effect, where water may be able to flow in to the basement and not be able to get back out after a flood. And this can create a pressure imbalance on the foundation that can ultimately impact the structural integrity of your foundation. I do want to clarify that this is for new construction or substantial improvement of structures in the floodplain. If a structure is in the floodplain and has a basement, depending on when it was built or what work has been done to it, a basement doesn't automatically equal a violation. It would just be for any structure built after the community joined the National Flood Insurance Program and any properties determined to be substantially improved regardless of their age. So yeah, basements not allowed in the floodplain, but not everything is necessarily a basement. So there are things that the National Flood Insurance Program considers enclosures. And enclosures are defined by FEMA as an enclosed walled-in area below the lowest floor of an elevated building. But the enclosure must not be below grade on all sides, because that would make it a basement. The enclosure must be used only for storage, building access, or parking. And if it is below the base flood elevation, then FEMA requires there to be flood openings in the enclosure. So for example, in the pictures that are on the slide, you can see 2 different types of raised homes. Both of them have flood openings, and the enclosure is not used as living space. In other words, it's either storage, building access, or parking. If any of these criteria are not met, then what is considered the lowest floor is going to change and to include that enclosure. And then if that occurs, then the lowest floor requirements for elevation may not be met, as we have previously talked about. So generally, the lowest floor means the lowest floor of the lowest fully enclosed area, which includes a basement. All right, so V zones, remember those are coastal zones, have slightly different requirements. This is because of that need to account for both tides and the velocity energy of the waves themselves. So an enclosure in a V zone must be free of obstructions or constructed with breakaway walls, open lattice work, and again, they can only be used for parking, building access, and storage. This is especially important in your V zones because these are what's going to be impacted the most by any coastal storms or high tide flooding. And the coastal areas generally just have a greater risk for structural damages due to flooding. All right, so I talked about flood openings. Now, this can be some people can get a little confused as to what these are and what they're supposed to be used for. So, flood openings are required for all fully enclosed areas below the base flood or below the lowest floor of a building that is below the base flood elevation in a special flood hazard area. Now the flood openings are they are to allow water into the basement during a flood because when a flood happens, that water is going to raise up against your foundation and it's going to be pressing on your foundation. And if there's only air in your basement or the enclosure, then your foundation is likely going to crumble and fail. So the flood vents is to allow that water to go inside your foundation, and that way it's pressing equally as hard on both sides of your foundation. That way there's not a pressure imbalance and your foundation should remain structurally sound. And then generally you will pair a flood opening with a sump pump, which will then remove the water from the basement after the flood waters have receded. So a lot of people can get confused on that, which is why I just wanted to take a moment to discuss what they're supposed to do. The flood opening requirements apply to all new construction or substantial improvements in the special flood hazard area and enclosed spaces below the lowest floor that are used for parking for vehicles, building access, storage. They are located below the base flood elevation and are fully enclosed. So flood openings may not be required if the enclosed area is above the base flood elevation, or it is not fully enclosed, meaning that the floodwaters can enter and leave directly, or if the building has been dry flood-proofed to or above the base flood elevation. So FEMA has some really great resources on flood openings and in foundation walls and walls of enclosures, which we have linked on our webpage. And there are other technical bulletins for other floodplain development and construction that FEMA has written. All right, so I've talked a little bit about substantial improvement and substantial damage. So to ensure that the to ensure that work performed aligns with the local substantial improvement requirements, a community must determine the project costs and compare them to the value of the structure. So a substantial improvement determination needs to be made for every single existing structure in your floodplain that is having any work done on it. There is no grandfathering when it comes to structures and the requirements in the floodplain related to the NFIP when it comes to substantial improvement. There are a few exceptions for work done related to life and safety code violations and historic structures, but those are very limited, and FEMA tends to want to exhaust all options before resorting to an exception of this requirement. For example, a historic structure needs to meet the definition in your regulations, and typically that means on a state or federal registry of historic places, not just any old structure, which we do have a lot of in New Hampshire, if a historic structure is going to be considered exempt, it must be on that state or federal registry of historic places. So if a structure is determined to be a substantial improvement or substantial damage, it must be brought into compliance as if it were new. And again, be aware of any intentional or unintentional changes to the proposed scope of work that could result in higher project costs and then change the determination. There is a FEMA desk reference for substantial improvement and substantial damage. That is a really great resource to learn about exactly what costs are required to include in the determination, as well as acceptable sources for determining the market value of the structure. All right, so the last common violation that I want to talk about today is recreational vehicles. So recreational vehicles are, for FEMA's purposes, they must either be on site for fewer than 180 consecutive days. And yes, that does mean that it can be driven off one day and then be back for the next. But it must be fully licensed and ready for highway use. And there must be no structures attached to the RV. These regulations are intended to ensure that if flooding were to occur, the vehicles can be moved quickly out of the area. And if these criteria are not being met, then the RV is essentially a manufactured home at that point and then must comply with the manufactured home requirements. All right, so now we're going to talk about best practices and tools for compliance. So I'm going to pass it back off to Stephanie for this section.
Thanks, Sarah. So can everyone see the presentation okay still? Thanks. So now we're going to be talking about best practices and tools for compliance. Starting with ways to bring a structure into compliance. This acronym is called FRED, which stands for floodproofing, relocation, elevation, and demolition. So in the next couple of slides, we'll be talking about each of those. The first of those techniques is floodproofing, which is probably the most common. There can be either dry floodproofing or wet floodproofing. Dry floodproofing is making a structure and its utilities and equipment watertight and impermeable to floodwater. Wet floodproofing means using techniques that allow floodwater to enter and exit automatically to minimize unequal pressure of water on the walls, typically through the use of flood vents. And just a note that dry floodproofing is not permitted in Zone Vs, which are coastal zones. And more information on this is outlined in FEMA's Technical Bulletin number 3, which we do have available on our website. Dry floodproofing can be used primarily for non-residential structures in A zones, and wet floodproofing is done on enclosures, garages, and accessory structures. And here we have a picture of a non-residential structure that's being wet floodproofed by retrofitting it with flood openings after Hurricane Katrina. Non-residential structures are permitted to be dry floodproofed through your local regulations, and if so, floodproofing designs must be certified by a registered design professional, typically a registered engineer. Any community should utilize the floodproofing certificate for non-residential structures for this purpose. Examples of dry floodproofing methods include temporary installation of waterproof membranes to prevent water from entering the structure, the use of sealants applied to walls, joints, and other openings, making sure that openings and walls are temporarily or permanently sealed shut. Temporary watertight shields can be placed over windows or doors, and addressing interior drainage to collect water that's leaking. Wet floodproofing can be used on enclosures that are below elevated buildings, again with the use of flood vents. Wet floodproofing can be used on attached garages, agricultural structures and accessory structures, and historic structures and functionally dependent uses when authorized by variances. A note on functionally dependent uses. This is a use which cannot perform its intended purpose unless it's located or carried out in close proximity to water. This term includes only docking facilities, port facilities that are necessary for loading and unloading of cargo or passengers, and shipbuilding and ship repair facilities, but does not include long-term storage or related manufacturing facilities. And here's some floodproofing resources from FEMA, and they're all linked here for your reference. The R in FRED is relocation. So depending on the situation, relocation may be an option as it provides the greatest security when the flood hazard is severe. It can also reduce flood insurance premiums, although this method can be very costly. Relocation can be appropriate in areas where the flood hazard is severe, such as in deep water, if there's rapid rates of rise and fall, short warming times, wave action, high velocity flow, high debris potential, long durations, or erosion. Relocation involves lifting the structure, putting it onto a flatbed truck, hauling it to a new site, and lowering it down onto a new foundation. So not surprisingly, this can be a very expensive mitigation method, but it is an option. Next is elevation. This is to raise a building to or above the flood elevation level that is adopted by the community. Depending on the specific situation, sometimes it's only the utilities that needs to be elevated or a portion of the structure that needs to be elevated to bring it into compliance. Typically, the process of elevating is to separate the structure from the foundations, raise it on hydraulic jacks, and the structure is held by temporary supports while a new or extended foundation is built below. This is a good method for structures that were originally built on basements, enclosures, or open foundations. If a structure is determined to be substantially improved or damaged, elevating it may be the solution to bring it into compliance. And the last method under this acronym is demolition. Depending on the specific situation, especially if a structure is severely substantially damaged, this may be the easiest way to bring the structure into compliance. Demolition can also be a good option for any low-cost structures out of compliance, for example, a shed or an accessory structure. Then, once demolished, if chosen by the property owner, a new compliant building can be built on site. And this can involve filling in a basement, grading, and landscaping. And here are some FEMA retrofitting resources that are also linked. So we just talked about some ways to bring a property into compliance, including the floodproofing, relocation, elevation, and demolition. Some other tools for compliance include your community having enforcement procedures for correcting violations. Part of a community's responsibility to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program is to enforce local floodplain regulations that are adopted by the community, and this is done by issuing and resolving violations. Communities may become aware of a violation through a complaint or a notification from FEMA, And in both situations, FEMA expects communities to exhaust all possible enforcement actions to correct that violation. At OPD, we are working on guidance to help you establish a procedure to follow that helps you identify and correct violations in your community regarding your floodplain ordinance. So the next couple of slides will be what those steps look like. Excuse me. In general, the process can look like issuing a violation, which would be mailing a formal written notice of violation or cease and desist order to the violator with a deadline for compliance, and making sure to cite the code sections that are being violated. Letters should be sent through certified and first-class mail, and hand delivery may sometimes be necessary. The violator has a right to appeal a community official's interpretation of the zoning ordinance to the Zoning Board of Adjustment. Deadlines may vary depending on the violation, but we recommend using a 90-day deadline for minor violations and 6 months for larger violations. And you should be following up with the violator before the deadline, requesting a status update to ensure that they are moving along and action is being taken. And that way you're informed on whether you might need to extend the deadline. And remember, the goal is compliance. So extensions are allowed as long as corrective action is being taken. It's also important to track response and document your follow-up communication. If there's been no response from the violator after 30 days, you should issue a second notice of violation via mail. After another 30 days, if you have no response, issue a third and final notice of violation. And you want to make sure you're tracking and documenting all of your attempts to reach the violator. There are laws for fines and penalties. State statutes allow communities to establish enforcement systems through fines and penalties to be used before a local summons is issued. If the violation is not able to be resolved through notices of violation and penalties, then the next step would be taking legal action. You should consult your community's attorney for what that involves, but generally there's Superior Court, which is best for complicated cases. It's a lengthier process and more expensive. And there's also District Court, which is used for straightforward violations and cease and desist orders. It's more efficient, less expensive, and you would notify the violator of legal action. Sometimes this will prompt the violation to be corrected, and therefore legal action would not be necessary. But FEMA will require a judicial ruling to consider all of the options fully exhausted at the community level. So continuing on with tools for compliance, it's important to know your ordinance. These are your community's regulations, and you should know what those requirements are and where the regulations apply. While you don't need to know every property off the top of your head, you should be sure to know how to determine if a property is in the floodplain. Also, remember that only FEMA can change the maps. I'm sure we've all heard people say they've lived in their house for 40 years and it's never flooded, but that doesn't mean that they're exempt from your community's floodplain regulations. Only a letter of map change, typically in the form of a LOMA, a letter of map amendment, can remove a property from your floodplain regulations. And finally, it's okay to get more information before providing an answer and or a permit to a property owner. It's okay to ask them for more information to make your determination, which you'll most likely need to do, especially if you're making a determination on a substantial damage or improvement. And it's okay to check with other resources such as the FEMA publications, my office, and request more guidance as needed. There is other documentation a community can require to help ensure structures are built and remain in compliance. First, a community can consider adopting and requiring a non-conversion declaration for structures with enclosures below the lowest floor. This form could be completed by the property owner and kept on file for that property. If a community wanted to adopt this, I would recommend working this into some type of procedure that's already followed, and then in your administrative procedures, and then just being consistent with all property owners in the special flood hazard area moving forward. Another documentation is a no-rise certification. Development, both building and non-building, is only permitted in the regulatory floodway permitted there is no rise of the base flood. That typically requires a hydrologic and hydraulic study to prove, but this certificate can be another tool utilized to ensure the community is meeting its floodplain regulations. Again, I'd recommend if a community chooses to adopt this form to incorporate it into an existing procedure so you're being consistent to all property owners moving forward. Another documentation is a flood opening certificate to be used in situations where it's not feasible or desirable to meet the minimum opening criteria as detailed in a community's floodplain ordinance. This document, like the ones before, must be signed and certified by a licensed professional. The last documentation is a V-zone certificate to ensure that all new or substantially improved structures in V-zones are designed and built to meet the community's floodplain regulations. This is not a substitute for an elevation certificate. It's just another tool for ensuring compliance of new or substantially improved structures. Inspections are another tool for compliance and often a way to catch any compliance concerns early on once a building is completed. This table is broken into 3 parts: the first inspection, a second, and third inspection. So for the first inspection, this happens before the ground is broken. With plans in hand, you should determine that the site as identified on the proposed plans is consistent with the actual ground conditions. You should be looking for the location of the floodplain and the floodway boundaries, setbacks from the lot lines, channel banks, and floodway encroachments. During the second inspection, this is done before installation of the lowest floor. You need to ensure that the lowest floor will be built at the height stipulated in the permit application and that the foundation is the type specified in the plans. Once the foundation is poured or laid, it can be very expensive for the property owner to change the building to make changes to the building location or the elevation of the lowest floor. And for the third inspection, this is done as the project is nearing completion. So you should be checking that the foundation and the floor elevation has not been altered, obtain the as-built elevation or floodproofing certificate, verify enclosures built lowest floors have adequate openings, check for breakaway walls in V zones, and check for floodway encroachments. You may also consider taking photos during final inspection to document compliance and retain that in the permit file. There are legal tools for compliance. Examples can be fines, stop work orders, and withholding a certificate of occupancy. You should keep evidence of these violations. This is usually in the form of files, correspondence, and pictures. Try to ensure that your evidence is telling a story and adequately shows the violation. And it's also helpful to log your phone conversations, keep your emails, and keep a good paper trail. There are laws for fines and penalties that are linked here. These provisions authorize municipalities to enact and enforce local ordinances and zoning regulations through administrative fines, civil penalties, and legal actions, including pre-summons enforcement, daily penalties, and recovery of enforcement costs and attorney fees for violations involving unlawful construction and land use. So we've gathered them and linked them here. Any legal action should be discussed with your municipal attorney. It's important to explain why it's important for the community to stay compliant and in good standing with the National Flood Insurance Program and not become suspended. You can ask what tools are in place to use if a violation is found, and remember to have everything documented. As we wrap this up, we just wanted to highlight some of the main takeaways. Communities are responsible for correcting violations and enforcing your floodplain regulations. Correcting violations may look different from community to community. There can be many approaches depending on the unique situation and type of violation. There are laws that enable communities to take enforcement action if needed. And remember that FEMA will require judicial rulings to consider the community enforcement options to be exhausted. So with that, that ends our presentation, but here's our contact information, and we can take some questions before the next presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah and Stephanie. This is a lot of information again. Glad you guys put it all together like that. I noticed that there was one other question in the chat, I think, Sarah, while you were talking about things having to do with basements and such. The question, what about the furnace?
Yeah, so furnaces would be considered under the broader category of utilities. And all utilities, machinery, and equipment have to be above the base flood elevation. So furnaces in the basement or furnaces in an enclosure below BFE, they generally should be raised up to that lowest floor that is above the base flood elevation. Yeah, and that's just because like if you have an oil furnace and a flood comes, we don't want to get oil contaminated into the water or to waterlog and ruin your utilities. So yeah, in short answer, yes.
Thanks. So anybody else, if you have a question, how about you could just raise your hand. Oh, okay, here's a text. Unfamiliar with reading FEMA maps. Can you recommend any resources for reading and interpreting FEMA maps to help in assisting in what homes are in the floodplain?
Yeah, we've done a couple trainings on reading the FEMA floodplain maps, and there's a couple websites that we use, but a good one is the FEMA Map Service Center. That's where they house all of their maps and preliminary maps and the pending maps and the flood insurance study reports that accompany the maps. And so that's kind of one of the official places to find the maps. And then there's also the National Flood Hazard Layer, which is it's a GIS interactive mapping tool that has the same mapping data as the Map Service Center, but I find it a little bit easier to use. And so I can always follow up with you after this and send you those links directly, as well as direct you to some of our previous trainings that talked about how to read the FEMA floodplain maps.
Stephanie, I went ahead and put the links in the chat to both of those.
Thank you.
And there is a pre-recorded training on the Office of Planning and Development's YouTube page going over how to navigate each of these websites and how to interpret the maps.
Do we have any other questions? Okay. If not, we will start the break a little bit early. We will have to, I think, wait until 2:15 to start the Q&A session, just because some people will be wanting to get to, that's the time that people will be knowing it will be done. Know it'll be beginning. So have an extra 15 minutes and we'll see most of you hopefully back